Welcome, dear friends, dear colleagues. Thank you so much for coming to this closing panel of the conference on reinvigorating the UN. The panel 4 is called Trust in Global Governance, Justice and the Rule of Law. Last panels at conferences are tough, and thank you so much for weathering it all the way until Saturday afternoon. A good friend of mine always tells the story that once he was in a similar situation, and it was a late panel, and everyone was already in state of fatigue, and he started with his presentation, and then someone in the first row, right opposite him, like Professor Kornprobst here, nodded off and began snoring very loud. So at first he thought, understandable, it's okay, no problem. He continued, but then it became so distracting that he had to interrupt his presentation and ask the lady next to the gentleman, like Lily over here, could you please just, could you? And she said, as Lily probably would, said, well, you put him to sleep, you wake him up. So we will try our best. We will try our best that we don't put you to sleep. We have the best speakers for this here assembled here today, and we will try to make this lively. We decided that we would also follow the pattern. Introductory statements from all the speakers. I will briefly present them in just a moment. Just maybe out of context, I thought it was the way that the conference is planned. We're trying to, with this panel, again, close the bracket, because we started out, if you recall, yesterday, it seems like a long time ago, yesterday we started out with a strong focus on international courts, on international tribunals. We started out with human rights, the Charter principles. Then we branched out into areas of peacekeeping. We went then into this morning diverse global issues, from space to health to climate and digitalization, returning to human rights and accountability. And now at the last panel, we are once again returning a little bit to governments and trust in governance, and also law and justice. So in order to close the circle in a way and see what this can mean and how this can be helpful and useful for the United Nations and our efforts to reinvigorate them. The panelists are in the following order that will speak. Are, first of all, Angela May, who is Chief Research and Trend Analysis Branch at UNODC, and she was previously, if I recall, at the UN Economic Mission for Europe in Geneva and also in UNODC in New York, so someone who really knows the UN very well. Second speaker will be Natalie Samarasinghe, who is Global Director for Advocacy of the Open Society Foundation and also UNA UK Executive Director. Then Michael Platzer, former senior UN official, co-chair of the Coalition of Faith-Based Organizations for Justice and ACUN's liaison here in Vienna. Then Klaus Bachmann, who is a renowned journalist and professor at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Warsaw. And finally, last but not least, Slavomir Redo, also a former UN senior expert, longtime member of the staff of UNODC. Those are the panelists, and again, as I said, we will start with some lively statements and then come to the question and answer session, where I hope you will all still be awake and ask a lot of questions. So please, may I start with you, Angela?
Thank you, Ambassador. And good afternoon to everyone. Well, hard to keep awake when we talk about data, because that's what I wanted to put a seed on your thoughts about re-energizing the United Nations through actually data. So I will start by just showing, you have discussed during this conference, came out a lot of time, the common agenda of the Secretary General, and the notion that the multilateralism is to protect something that we all own. And the idea is that we have to stay together, do something together to protect that common space. And you see that the Secretary General has identified different areas from health, environment, that you have discussed, so I will not go into the details. But I wanted to put you to show, to see that there is also an element of information. So do we have a common good that speaks about the knowledge, the facts that we have? You know, there is the famous things that were said once in the US Congress. You know, everybody is entitled to have an opinion, but we are not entitled to have our own facts. You know, the facts and the evidence is something that is not personal, but that is really based on common standard. So the way how we protect, you know, again, one of the ways that we operate in multilateralism is through what we say international conventions. And so in a way to establish systems of incentives for compliance, for all going and doing certain things together, but also sanctions when there is not compliance. And I wanted to show you where we are particularly here in Vienna focusing on what we call the transnational threats that are relating to drugs and crime. And you know, what I would call the UN Vienna Convention. So you all know that here, in a way, we are home to and custodians of the Convention on the Drugs, transnational organized crime, corruption, and now you know that the member states are negotiating a new convention on cybercrime. But the common element, okay, I don't have the time to move to go into the discussion on all of this convention, but there is a common element in all of this convention, and not only on this, the recognition by member states that in order to address transnational threats, so something that goes beyond our border, we also need to share data and information, and we need, again, together, we can put together that knowledge that we need to fight the challenges. And here is just an example. In UNODC, we work a lot to talk about what we say, connect the dots. And so the maps that you see here that speaks about trafficking of drugs, trafficking of wildlife, trafficking of firearms, etc. This, we can build that knowledge only when there is that sharing of information from different countries, because there is not one country alone that can see the whole picture, particularly, again, on these transnational threats. And so looking at the multilateralism through and the UN and the role of the UN as the custodian of that common facts and knowledge that can help us then in single countries to understand how to fight these challenges. And I wanted to, say that where I want to put the seed on your mind is to say maybe looking through the data is a way also, maybe an easier way in a polarized world that we have today on everything that we discuss at global level. Maybe data is a common aspect that maybe can help to bring all the different politics together. Where do we have opportunities? Again, I don't have to explain to you that we live in a place where we have more data than we never had, more data than what we can digest or understand. And there is also with a high recognition of the power of data. I'm sure you have seen headlines, data, the new oil. And so data that start to have an economic but also social value recognized by communities. But also the transnational crisis that we are living. And think about the COVID and see how important that has been for understanding, for operating under COVID, understanding the data and collecting data from other countries. And see the challenge that we had when countries have not shared those data. And what, how the sharing of the data can really, maybe could have helped us to act differently, maybe to have a different type of crisis if the data that we're sharing more transnationally would have been of a better quality. But there are also challenges, and one of the challenges that we have, and I can tell you we experience a lot, people like me that deal with a lot with the data in the UN, is that very often national pride comes before this commitment to build that common knowledge. And so, countries that look more and say, oh, if my country doesn't look good in that maps that I showed you earlier, then we fight. Without, and that is as a stronger value than actually thinking at the bigger picture. And in a way that every country looks bad and good somewhere. But then there is also, I'm sure you have discussed it in 2 days, a more of a crisis of multilateralism, and so also the trust. Is the UN that really has that neutrality that is needed to bring that knowledge so that, a country is not pointed out just because the UN wants to point out to a country or not. And that is indeed the challenge. How do we rebuild that trust? How do we build trust in the data that other nations, again, we deal, for example, like drug trafficking. We have countries that say, well, the drug that I see in my country come from country B. And so, but country B say, no, but I don't trust, because I don't trust that country, so they are not giving you the truth. So if there is not that trust, how can we bring it together? But there is also an issue that is more, and I don't have the time to go through, but is really a fundamental issue that is emerging that also would influence other issues of multilateralism, and is the different approach that countries are having in cross-border data flows, so sharing data. You don't have to look at the details. Here is a table that comes from UNCTAD, the report of UNCTAD. But basically, what this table says is that how countries are emerging and looking at data is emerging very differently. So you have countries, particularly in Asia, where the data are mostly controlled by government. So government decide how to share and what data to share or not and to collect. Then you have the Europeans, Latin America region, where basically the data are more protected for individuals. So, you know that the privacy that we have in Europe and the laws, etc. And then you have from the other side, the other extreme, or North America, and like Oceania, Australia, etc., where actually the data are controlled by private sector. And so that, I think, is the big challenge that we have if we want to look at the governance of data around the world, and whether these approaches, and these are emerging because there has not been a global approach to data. And so these are, all of these tectonic plates differently have emerged without that, if you want, common debate, discussion. And so the question is, are these reconcilable? Or, again, we are going to a different direction, and we will not be able to define a global architecture, but just probably regional architecture. And that's where I wanted to put the seed. Should we start talking about a new global data governance architecture that would, benefit all for not the data by itself, but through across peace and security, development, humanitarian crisis, and how can we start building that notion of this global architecture? And also overcoming the current concentration of data that we have. Again, I'm sure I don't have the time to elaborate this, but if there is not that any architecture, we will end up where the control of data will be on the hands of few countries and few private sectors. Sorry, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm trying to go faster. I have 3 minutes. Yes. So. But data governance could also be a bridge builder. And why? For example, in New York, you have the UN Statistical Commission, and it's probably one of the, I guess probably the only one, but maybe not, of the decision-making formal intergovernmental bodies that remain technical. Well, it's not really political. So it's a place, again, where countries where you don't see the polarization that you see in any other topics that you see. So that's a place where we can start. And then we have also examples of the Cold War. I don't have the time to go through those examples, where even during the Cold War, the two worlds were coming together and they were able to develop some common standards on statistics, for example. So How can we move from there? Maybe the first step is to recognize that we have common data principle beyond statistics. Again, don't have the time to go through the difference between data and statistics. But that could be a way, and from the UN, to really have a more of a code of conduct where the UN can really become the custodian. And the last slide is just to say how we can move. We now have an uneven, I call it global data collection systems, where member states contribute how, when they want. And so there is an uneven commitment in a way. Some countries genuinely provide data, others less. I discussed earlier the different approach the countries have to data. So how can we move from this to actually develop a joint, the notion of a joint responsibility of the common global data system, where every country, has the same commitment to the quality of data and the same commitment to share for the benefit of this global good. And then, so that's my proposal, where I wanted to start a discussion where this could be an element where we can start to re-energizing the form of multilateralism that we need today to address all of these common challenges that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. That was energetic and precisely time-wise to the point. Thank you so much. We're now moving to Natalie, who I hope we will be able to see on the screen in a second. Yes, we see you, Natalie. I'm not sure if you can hear us also.
I can hear you.
And we can hear you. That's perfect. So please, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to join you. I'm going to have a baby very soon. That's the reason I couldn't travel, but I really do regret not being in Vienna with you. I grew up in the city. I miss it a lot. I miss it every time I have a bad cup of coffee in London, which happens a lot. So I'm sorry I'm not there. So I'm going to focus my remarks today on the question of trust, drawing on the polling on the UN and consultations that I've conducted with civil society, the public, and other groups for almost 2 decades now. We've just heard a presentation on data. So please, all the usual caveats apply. I'm drawing conclusions from polling. But I think it's a good starting point for this discussion. And it's a very encouraging one for people who care about the UN. Over 90% of people globally are aware of the UN. It is a top brand. And over 3/4 of the world's population see it as essential to global challenges. So far, good news for the UN. But there is a big gap and the numbers drop when it comes to the UN's performance. So there's very strong support, for example, for the UN playing a role in human rights, but people are much less convinced about its achievements in the area. But interestingly, the areas where it's been deemed less successful, they still score highly in terms of people wanting it to act. The second sort of data point I found really interesting from these polling exercises is that there isn't necessarily a correlation between people wanting the UN to play a role and trusting it. So the global levels of trust, and this is sort of data from about 15 years across regions, hovers at about 40%. It's generally lower in developing regions where 1 or 2 countries put their average up. So for example, in Asia, South Korea significantly boosts the average, but the actual perceptions and levels of trust are much lower. In certain countries, it's actually under 10%. That's the case for much of the Middle East, including in countries where the UN has a very large footprint through humanitarian or peacekeeping organizations. So why? When you conduct interviews with people and try to figure out what's wrong, it's clear that some of this is just skepticism rooted in, the broader mistrust of governments and institutions. I'm sure, you've been discussing the multiple crises we are facing. People do see a failure of leadership. They see a failure of our economic and political systems. They see inequality. They have a sense of injustice, unequal application of rules. And amidst all of this, the UN is charged with failing to meet its aspirations. So its supporters are usually a little bit upset that it's not a world government, and its critics are scared that it is. And there are many leaders who like to fuel these perceptions of the UN, either as a tool of the West or a playground for dictators. And I think what's interesting, though, is that the reason some of these perceptions are so hard to shift is that there's usually a kernel of truth in them. So, for example, I've spent many years trying to highlight the extent to which Global South actors shaped the UN since its founding, instrumental in everything from human rights to inclusion of women to the structures that were created. But, there is still a strong sense that the UN remains in its structures, in its programmings, in its mindset, a construct of dominant and largely Western players. So you have the UN playing a great role in decolonization, but you also have a sense that it has protected the status quo in international relations, the Security Council being the obvious symbol of that, even as global power has shifted. You have a UN that often criticized the neoliberal policies of the World Bank and the IMF, but it also to some extent helped to implement them. So, I'm sure you did a lot of problem diagnosis over the last day and a half. So let me make 5 quick points on solutions. The first solution, I think, is a narrative about the UN as a global organization helping national leaders. The UN could really lead the charge in sort of reversing. I think you may recall a few years ago, there were lots of right-wing leaders who came together and said, we're going to form a transnational alliance of nationalists. And, I think I found it a little bit amusing at the time, but of course, we've seen disinformation, funding of, extreme right-wing across borders, cyber attacks, election interference, that's growing. And the UN could lead the charge in the opposite direction, supporting a kind of healthy version of nationalism, helping democratic leaders deliver for their people. So how can the UN, in partnership with the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks, how can it increase the fiscal space for governments to really deliver through debt for climate swaps, through the multilateral development bank reforms that are currently being discussed? There is a little sort of line in the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda about closer relationships with these institutions. And I think that relationship is going to be absolutely crucial for the future, for the public, but also for the relevance of the UN. The second area of potential solutions is in sort of remedying the gaps and this perception of double standards at the UN. A few days ago, I met with Ukrainian civil society. They were very keen to discuss how they could increase global solidarity and also translate that into votes at the General Assembly for future resolutions. And the discussion was really around, can we use some of the exceptionalism that has been applied to Ukraine to drive broader change? So looking at ways to strengthen the role of the UN General Assembly, for example. I think Chiara mentioned that in the presentation yesterday. I was listening in, closing the gap on accountability for aggression, really kind of looking at how do we build on some of the space that now exists to make these changes to secure grains for Ukraine, but also for other countries. The third solution is localization. Many organizations, including my own, within the philanthropic sector, aid sector, development sector, human rights, have had this debate around decolonization. How can we become more legitimate? I think in a way the UN, I think the debate is really still to hit the UN in some ways. And for many, the answer has been localization. And you see this as a very strong trend, and always has been for many years in the UN. It's the focusing on giving power to the field, investing in the local offices. But there are still issues here. You have the power dynamics on the ground, you have the compromises you have to make with governments, you have the differences between local and international staff. Just the symbolism of a compound in a local community can be quite counterproductive. So there could be, an issue here about, are we basically prioritizing the UN presence at the expense of building local capacities and working with local partners? So I think it is time to give thought about how can the UN hand over some tasks in a much, much more extensive way than it has, particularly on the development side, to partners on the ground. That links to the fourth point very briefly. If the UN was able to hand over this area of work that still takes up about 70% of its budget and staff in the development realm to communities, it could really focus on the areas where it can add value on data, as we've just heard, on foresight, on analysis, but also human rights, norm setting, investigation, mediation, all these things that are very difficult for local actors to do. And finally, inclusion. I think there's a real need in addition to kind of including stakeholders in the delivery of some of these global governance tasks, to also integrate them into decision-making and oversight. So integrating them into UN offices and processes. I think Amandeep mentioned before, there are areas like tech where you need to have multi-stakeholder models because governments are not, clearly the only players or even often in the driving seat. But we also need more investment in the ground on transparency, in trying to engage directly with people and communities, not just through civil society who can be gatekeepers. And I think there's a lot that the UN could do relatively low cost through websites, social platform, also through partnership initiatives where people don't have access to the internet, but it just really hasn't been a priority. In general, mostly because of pushback by member states, but there is also quite a lot of skepticism, I feel, having worked at the UN for a little bit, amongst officials too. So these are some very broad ideas. I discussed them in a lot more detail in a book project I worked on with Tom Weiss and Rawdon Wilkinson, which is coming out this summer. Sorry for the plug. So I hope we can continue the conversation, but I really look forward to some reactions and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Natalie, both for making this a very lively and focused intervention and also to sticking to the timelines. And I will give right over to Michael Platzer, please.
Yes, I don't know if this is working properly. I am, okay, good. It's a tough act to follow. The two ladies have really done a fantastic job. I am older now, and I'm looking back at my career at the UN and so forth. And also at Vienna in 1945, this place was destroyed. And there was community action to rebuild Vienna stone by stone, the Trümmerfrauen. So I think the people who made the charter were brilliant. And Eleanor Roosevelt was a fantastic woman. We wouldn't have gotten so far. And I think we got bogged down somewhere. And now we're becoming perhaps too bureaucratic. It's going all over the place. I see the only hope for the UN really in the people, we the people, and particularly religious, God-fearing people that said that 70% of mankind still believe in the divine. The charter is based on good neighborliness, the golden principle. Most religions have something like that in it. And we need to inspire people to go out and do things for other people. And there needs to be tolerance and respect for the other. We've become very cynical, and we know our society. We've become selfish. We've become materialistic. We don't care about the people in Africa or the people in Asia or the people even in the Ukraine. People in Europe, people are happy. The refugees stay away now. Before, there was a time when we would welcome people and we'd treat them with respect and integrate them into our society. So I think we have to go back to basic values. I think we have to go back to our churches, synagogues, mosques, and inspire people to do basic civic actions. I think the UN is a good structure for that. We have so many treaties, conventions, anti-corruption, cybercrime, whatever. But it comes down to the individual. If we want to get rid of the cynicism about the UN, I think we all have to look on ourselves a little bit and get motivated again. And that's why I have, together with a colleague from New York, we've created a coalition of faith-based organizations. We met in San Francisco where the charter was signed, and we had people from all faiths, from Hinduism, Sikhism, come together, and we had a small thing. The UN has taken it seriously, well, to agree, but there's still a difficulty to get in and be accepted. I think this is the problem of civil society, and I don't know how you're going to integrate the youth into an accepting role. You know, it's very nice to have the youth sit in the back row somewhere and we have a discussion about how youth is important. But how do we integrate them? So I see someone nodding. It's good. Yeah, I think the basic principles of the United Nations are still valid. The golden rule, equality, good governance, tolerance, those things. And it's strange, it was the World Bank which first brought the UN different faiths into the World Bank to consider how the money should be dispensed. So I think we should have more of that kind of action, not just have a side event which people will listen to or not listen to, but certainly not, and that will not change things. I think our popes, our bishops, our religious leaders have an important role in the Ukraine and in the Middle East. And my plea is that we all respect the other, do something about what we can in our little world, whether that's in Vienna or with our home country. So I'm very much of going back to basics and back to where the UN came from. I started off as a human rights officer, so I have something in common with many of the speakers. And my first boss was someone who worked for the Nuremberg Tribunal. No one is mentioning the Nuremberg Tribunal, and yet they have established basic principles of justice for bad guys. So I think we also have to go looking back a little bit, as well as forward, Angela. I'm certainly in favor of everything you said, and also everything that was said by our friends from London. But I would like to enter into a dialogue with you people, how you see it, how your individual perspective on changing the UN or empowering the UN or reinvigorating the UN. The UN was a fantastic organization. We had it in the Korean War, we had it in the Middle East, we had it in many, Bosnia and other places. So I think we need to feel positive about it. That's I guess my final word, and I think it goes back to various religious roots that all of our religions have.
Thank you very much, and you gave us. And you also gave us extra minutes for the dialogue that you are willing to enter into, so that's very appreciated as well. We will move on here right away and go to Klaus Bachmann, please.
Yes, thank you. I did not forget to switch it on, so you can hear me, and I can hear that you can hear me. I'm well aware that together with Slavomir Redu, I'm the only remaining obstacle to the end of this conference. And instead of reinvigorating the United Nations, I'm going to, I hope I will reinvigorate the audience. I skipped the introduction to my presentation because we already discussed these issues yesterday. mainly with Judge Hofmannsky, who explained why the ICC doesn't have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in the Russian-Ukrainian case. Might well have jurisdiction over that in other cases, but not in this one. I skip the argument eventually sometimes popping up about the European Court of Human Rights, because here we have the same situation. Russia was evicted from the Council of Europe. There was a transition period during which it was still obliged to comply with the verdicts and the conventions, but now this transition period is over. And in addition, the Duma in Moscow is about to to terminate actually, I think 21 international conventions, among which are also the European Convention of Human Rights, and there's some speculation whether they want to reintroduce the death penalty, which might help in the recruitation of army soldiers and getting rid of dissidents. We don't know that, that's speculation, but anyway, I mean, the European Court of Human Rights, with its very limited possibilities to interfere here, is not on the agenda anymore. So what is left? What is left are domestic courts under universal jurisdiction, that we also mentioned yesterday. And the reaction to that very limited scope of international criminal justice concerning the crime of aggression has led to a discussion about creation of ad hoc tribunals. And the first idea was, of course, let's create an ad hoc tribunal like in the case of Yugoslavia and Rwanda. It worked quite well. Well, I have some different opinions on that, but generally it worked. The problem is, in order to do that, you need a vote in the Security Council, and we can be quite sure that Russia will veto it, and maybe even China will veto it. And then we may have the problem that in the Council there will not even be a majority, because we also have to take into account, depending on the moment when the vote will pass, the non-permanent members of the Security Council, and that may lead to a situation where, for example, the British or the Americans introduce such a project into the Security Council, and then it gets rejected with a majority, and then the next day we will see on Russian television that actually there are no war crimes and there is no crime of aggression because the Security Council has rejected it. And because everybody knows that, it will never be introduced. So my recommendation, because there seems to be a wish for recommendations here in the audience, my recommendation is forget it. The next proposal was actually a few weeks ago. There was introduced by the Dutch Parliament and by the European Parliament for a hybrid tribunal based on an agreement between the European Union and Ukraine on the example of other hybrid tribunals. But the day before yesterday, we had another proposal from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe to introduce a hybrid tribunal, but to pass it not through the Security Council, but to the United Nations General Assembly, and then to create it in cooperation with Ukraine and the Council of Europe. Well, now we have a problem, because if both proposals are accepted and succeed, then we will have a rat race between two tribunals. And my recommendation, not really serious, is to empower them both with the principle of priority, like the Yugoslav and the Rwanda tribunals had, because then we even can bet who will get the suspects and who will get the records. Nevertheless, that was not serious, of course. But it also already shows something, because the question yesterday also was how does this interfere with the ICC mandate? And we will see that if one of these tribunals emerges, I don't think that both will, but hopefully not. But if one of them emerges, comes into being, and it will act under the priority principle, then it will outline or it will sideline the ICC, which works under the complementarity principle. That's the first thing. It will also draw resources, it will draw personnel, it will undermine the legitimacy of the ICC to some extent, and it will compete with the ICC in terms of, and that's something that Judge Hofmanski told me yesterday. I didn't yet check it, but I believe him. He knows it better than me. That the elements of crime, of the crime of aggression and the elements of crime of war crimes overlap largely, so that it creates a situation where the same person will be sought by the ICC and by this hybrid tribunal. But that is not even my main argument. My main argument is about legitimacy and immunity. Because a hybrid tribunal passed by the United Nations General Assembly will trigger a vote where we have probably all or even more, countries that abstained from the vote in the Ukrainian resolutions. There are several, and of course there were different outcomes in the different votings, but there is a pattern where you can say we have something like 30, 40 countries that abstain from the vote. I'm not talking about those few who were against the resolution, but just the ones that want to be neutral. And just look at what happens at the moment in South Africa and you get an impression of what is going to happen. Now, the United Nations General Assembly passes such a vote with all these other countries abstaining. They will probably also not support such a hybrid tribunal. So, well, you can say, well, we are going to create it anyway here in Europe. The problem is when it comes then to apprehending fugitives. If there will be anybody to apprehend, that's a different question. Because these fugitives, they usually acted in a state capacity, and they act in a state capacity when they will be apprehended, at least as long as they remain in power in Russia. And during that time, in accordance with the regulations about immunity under domestic law and under the famous 2002 arrest warrant judgment of the ICJ, enjoy immunity. And we had that problem, that is also South Africa. We had that problem in the al-Bashir case, where South Africa had a conflict, a tension between the obligation to transfer al-Bashir to the ICC and to grant him immunity under international law. And there is no hierarchy between the two. To some extent, the ICJ judgment of 2002 creates a kind of hierarchy. I mean, I have the impression, I'm no international lawyer. When I read it, I had the impression there is some kind of hierarchy, but it's the opposite of what we expect. Actually, you have, as long as the people are in function, as long as they have a government job, I would say, or represent their country, you have to respect the immunity. That doesn't mean the court doesn't have jurisdiction, but he can exercise this jurisdiction when they step down or when they retire or when their country decides that, to kick them out, for example. Then you can step in. But as long as they are, immunity goes first. So that is a problem. Already with countries that would subscribe to such a hybrid tribunal and have the obligation to respect immunity. But in the case of South Africa, which most probably will remain neutral in such a vote, and is neutral now. I mean, it's a kind of declaration by the government about Russia now, because at the beginning they voted for the Russian withdrawal from Ukraine, but now they say it's not our conflict. So in a situation where, let's say, Lavrov goes to South Africa, like he does now, and they have to apprehend him, they will not have any tension between anything because they only have the obligation to respect his immunity, because they don't subscribe to this hybrid tribunal. And 40 other states, more or less 40 other states, will not do that. So what is the value? What is the value of a hybrid tribunal which, well, covers only a small, relatively small, territorially, very small part of the world? That means basically Europe, maybe a part of North America. Of course, there is also the question, and that's the reason for this title, of state cooperation. At the moment, we cannot count on any state cooperation with Russia. One of my colleagues who wrote about that said, well, okay, but if Russia gets democratic, But he used it actually in the opposite way I would do it, because he said, well, then the Russians can punish Putin, Lavrov, Shoigu, and all the others, because then they will have a democratic judiciary, independent and so on, and they can apply all the provisions on the agenda. Well, my argument would be opposite. A democratic Russian in transition, because it's not going to happen from one day to the next one. It takes several years. And if we look at the experience of the Yugoslav tribunal during the Yugoslav transition after Milosevic, that was very bumpy. I mean, transitional governments are weak. They don't control the judiciary. Well, fortunately, you can say, because we wanted the judiciary to be independent, but usually the judiciary is from the ancien regime, right? The same is with law enforcement. There are whole parts of the bureaucracy that they do not control. In the Yugoslav case, until I don't think like 2007, 2010, something like that, there was a situation where they had a lonely war crimes prosecutor searching for these fugitives, and we had the army command passing money to them because they were on retirement as army officers, right? So that is something that for years and years and years, the transitional government of Serbia could not deal with, could not handle. And I think we can be absolutely sure that we will have the same situation with Russia with a transitional government in Russia. So actually the argument plays out to the other side. It will be even more complicated than now. I'm not talking, I should talk probably about Nuremberg Tribunal. The only thing I want to say is nobody's going to occupy Russia. So we don't have the same situation as the Nuremberg Tribunal had in occupied Germany, where they had access to everything. We'll probably never get that. What is the conclusion? Now my conclusion is to disinvigorate the United Nations here, and not to pass that through the General Assembly and create a hybrid tribunal, but to leave it to universal jurisdiction. The funny thing is, and I don't know why, I didn't know that until recently, then I discovered it, universal jurisdiction, that means domestic court, in most countries in Europe and in many countries in the world have jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. They can punish that. They can prosecute and punish that, not only the usual international crimes like genocide and crimes against humanity and so on, but also the crime of aggression. Let's do them. Let's handle them with that. Of course, they face the same problem with immunity, but I mean, that we would have anyway. So the question is, why should we build an additional trawler if we are sure we can't get the big fish anyway? I'm not sure, but that's now it leaves law and it goes into politics. I'm not sure whether it is a good idea at all to legalize, I mean, to put the whole conflict on that legal level, because there may be a situation in the future, and there was already in the past. I'm always saying Medvedchuk, for those in the audience who remember the case, where the Ukrainian government may have to decide whether to exchange a prisoner for its own prisoners in Russia or to put him on trial in an international tribunal when he is lost for any prisoners exchange. Or, after 2014, under the Minsk agreement, we had amnesties for fighters, for separatists in Donbass and on the other side of the demarcation line. We may have such a situation where it may be beneficial to pass an amnesty, but then we have the ICC, or we have this hybrid tribunal with the priority principle saying, no, you cannot amnesty this guy because I want him. And then they cannot negotiate about that. I mean, this is the famous peace against justice dilemma from the Dayton peace conference, if you remember that. So I'm not sure it is a good idea at all, but if you want to punish through universal jurisdiction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a very lively contribution as well. And we're going to the next and last speaker of the panel, Slavomir, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, distinguished participants. As I am the last speaker in the last panel of this conference, co-organized by the United Nations Studies Association with the Diplomatic Academy, before the imminent grande finale furioso. And as if I was called to put the last accord in this. This is not true, it won't happen. It is up to the Austrian hosts to conclude and to close this conference. So I'm simply one person in the orchestra of the Friends of the United Nations, playing now solo before you the case which is entitled, maybe quite dramatically, Solidarity, Justice and the UN Rule of Law Lethal Challenge. Well, you know where we sit. We sit in the Diplomatic Academy that was established in 1754. Primo voto Oriental Academy, where 3 centuries ago, students of the Academy, German students of the Academy were taught Persian, Arabic, Turkish, in service of monarchy, in going and in contacts with the Ottoman Empire. Now I speak to you in English. 3 ages later, having in mind the above background, objective of the conference, reinvigorating the United Nations, and of course the history of the Academy. And I wanted originally to speak to you about the classic dichotomy between East and West, that we learned a lot for a long time. And then 2 developments that you have and other panelists have mentioned simply prompted me to recast my statement. The first development was quite often referred to, the United Nations Security Council meeting on the 24th of February last year. In about an hour into it, the president of the Russian Federation announced in Moscow that a quote-unquote special military operation in Ukraine, Eastern Donbas region had commenced. And that was the Security Council venue, a very symbolic venue for this announcement, also maybe ostensible and ominous, because it showed a fault line between 2 worlds and fault line on global peace and war, indeed of tectonic nature. In the East, we see it in the Commonwealth of Independent States with its own imploded fault lines, and Russia's strategic reorientation toward China. And the West undergoes the test of the strength of its own solidarity when various forms of assistance to Ukraine, debated, delivered or not, take place. So there are 2 sides of the picture in the making, and the Security Council, as if it was holding the fort, as if it was holding the fort, but in fact it is paralyzed. It is paralyzed. Now the second development is another Security Council, but this time resolution 2006-58 of last year, 2022, of the 2nd November, and by it the Council with which rests the mandate to overlook the implementation of the Dayton Agreement, the Bosnia and Herzegovina Agreement from 1995, extended the legal mandate of the European Union's in Bosnia-Herzegovina for another year. Hence also it extended the mandate of its constitutional court for another year. On this court, on the bench of this court sit 9 judges, 4 selected by the country's House of Representatives, 2 designated by Republika Srpska, and 3 international judges appointed by the European Court of Human Rights. And these judges keep an upper hand as far as the rule of law in Bosnia and Herzegovina is concerned. They adjudicate most serious cases regarding Bosnia and Herzegovina, regarding territorial integrity and sovereignty. Until 2010, they were also adjudicating more often than now on cases of organized crime and corruption. If my memory serves me well, since 2010, due to political pressures, there are less cases of the latter nature in the court's dock. And here comes my first observation concerning exactly the fact that we were already bringing up before at the panel, that corruption, if it's not adjudicated, can drain the utility from any assistance program and undermine the legitimacy of post-war governments in the eyes of the peoples. And this fact that there is so little attention to corruption and organized crime cases in the court docket is worth noting. At that time, a few months ago, the Russian Federation agreed to extend the European Union's mandate under the condition that in the resolution there is no mention by name of the office of the High Representative of the European Union. And as I read from the press release, United Nations press release, the Russian Federation representative said at the Council that Western countries are, I quote, imposing special envoys and an illegitimate protégé. As she described, I continue the press release, the internationally appointed High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I quote it again, on the country usurping the authority of those who have been lawfully elected. She called on the office of the High Representative or the quote-unquote body of colonial governance, end of quote, to be closed, thus enabling the population to heave a sigh of relief. End of quote from that press release. These 2 developments in the Security Council must have flashed something in your mind. You may remember that at the end of the past century, a well-known American political scientist, Samuel Huntington, was very popular with his theory of the clash of civilizations. And his like-minded readers and experts even drew the line that this cultural fault line concerning the clash of civilization going up from the Barents Sea, in which there is a coast of Norway and Russia, then along the coast of the Baltic State, going to Belarus. Some deviations show that also Eastern Poland is there. Then further down through Ukraine, then further down to Romania, then sharply to the left through Serbia, down to Bosnia-Herzegovina, Adriatic Sea, where Bosnia and Herzegovina borders with Albania. So that is the idea that since that time, plus minus shows this one fault line, and the other one is up there at the Bering Straits. So, of course, there are exceptions. There are other countries with other legal cultures, but this is roughly what Huntington meant in very ideal terms, like, certainly Max Weber ideal types. So, with this looks like something that is cast in stone, but not to the point to tell and to remark on yesterday's presentation of Ambassador Marschik that really these are not two worlds, but there are three worlds. There is also the Russian world, which comes in between Western Christianity, Orthodox, and Islam, within part of Orthodox. So the difference, according to those who believe in this kind of theory between East and West, with this Russian world inside, is that people look differently at access to justice in the West and in the East. In the West, people look at justice as an emancipative right, for which they are able to fight and want to have access to justice out of their own motivation. While in the Eastern world, so the story goes, everything is about existential needs. That is, that someone else will provide for this existential need, will meet this existential need, and in a sense we can wait and this will be delivered. But this is, of course, as I said, a very maybe too simple presentation. Be that as it may, and as I only have 3 minutes to finish, I wanted to speak in this panel about its main title. And the main title is, again, we spoke about trust. What is trust? Now, trust in global governance. And I came across such a metaphor. I understand that trust implies the situation in which a parent throws a child up and the child smiles because the child knows that you will catch him or her falling down. So think about the United Nations and trust in the United Nations. That's something that this metaphor prompted me to conclude in the following terms. First, and sadly, you heard already the name of Tadeusz Mazowiecki, former Solidarity Prime Minister of Poland, who became the UN Special Rapporteur to investigate the situation of human rights in former Yugoslavia, who resigned from his office because the UN was not able to prevent the Srebrenica genocide, in which 7,000 Bosniak Muslims were killed. Because at that point, everybody really lost the trust. And while this was the UN intervention was militarily impossible, so is impossible in Ukraine. So second, given such impossibilities, it is currently fundamentally important for the rule of law there to counter corruption. To recall, generally corruption can drain the utility from any assistance program and undermine the legitimacy of post-war governments in the eyes of their peoples. Third, because the above observation may be relevant to the development in Ukraine, schooling and training in integrity is a must and should not be addressed for later, as the case now be for Bosnia and Herzegovina, but should be also addressed now in Ukraine. In one way or another, the relevant United Nations and other stakeholders should measure up to the corruption and rule of law lethal challenge amid war in Ukraine. So the slogan Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine, will have its strong impact for the UN rule of law after the war. Fourth, depending on the outcome of the war in Ukraine and the simmering conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, through both countries emerges a new limes orientalis in people's minds and among the peoples of the United Nations. It may be running through the current EU or further east and south, down to the coast of the Adriatic Sea, that is, if in both countries the UN as a benevolent conqueror eventually wins there the rule of law battle. Hopefully later there should be new outposts flagging larger freedom across the Bering Strait. And last but not least, to paraphrase Michelle Obama's book title and apply it to the United Nations, the light its message carries will then shine more strongly than now in the time of the present survival test to solidarity, justice, and the rule of law across the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Slavomir. Thank you. Audience, also, you've been very patient. As you can see, we have tried to put together a very diverse panel with very different approaches to different issues, and also the freedom of the Academy allows us to also listen to everyone's views. I have to say one thing, though, just in case there is a misunderstanding. I do not believe that the world is divided in three complete different cultures or worlds. I think the perception, though, arises because they are focusing on complete different issues and narratives are presented that are in contradiction. So you get the feeling as though you are in three different worlds, which is a very different thing than actually being in three different worlds. But still, that's where I immediately look into the audience and have, fortunately, a question already over there in the back. Thank you very much for breaking the ice. I have another one over there. Please, we will need the microphone now, and I see over there also one. Maybe we start with you because the microphone reached you first. Please.
Thank you very much. My name is Nina Ernst. I'm a student at the Diplomatic Academy. I have a question for Ms. Angela May. Because you said there is growing recognition of the importance of data sharing, I was wondering if you see a change in willingness and trust after the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we will collect a couple of questions, if that's all right. So the next one, I'm sorry you were the first, but you now are the next to get the microphone. Please.
Yes, thank you very much. My question, or rather a comment, is directed to Mr. Platzer. Whereas it really resonated a lot to me, what you said, even though I'm not religious whatsoever, I think you don't have to. I don't share this vision of the world back then that everything was better, because when the UN was founded, we had to face racism, we had to face a lot of inequalities. Think about women, think about gays, think about LGBTIQ, whatsoever. So I think today we live in a much better world than back then, even when the UN was founded. However, I think that you have a very valid point when you talk about visions that we somehow do not really have there anymore. I do not see anyone launching leading a protest screaming, "I have a dream," right? And I think this is really important that we do have those kind of people leading for a global society that is, having everyone living a fulfilled and just life. So I do share your vision, and I do share the spread of tolerance and respect for each of one of us. And I think we should more listen to visions, of course not radical ones, as we have seen in the last century a lot. So perhaps a little bit more humane visions. And what we need, in my opinion, is more bravery. So we need to be more brave in order to look forward to a good form of multilateralism. How?
Maybe it was just too long.
I was cut off. Okay, very short point. How about we envision just as one idea of many, perhaps, a world government, a democratic world government, right? A new form of multilateralism. As a vision, I don't say it's a perfect idea. And of course, we can all work on the idea together. But how would this look like? And I also look at the West here.
But I would ask you to come to the end
Yes.
of your point all the same.
So sorry.
One question.
Who does not contribute in multilateral forms like the WTO, like the ICJ, ICC? So I think we can, even in the West, we can improve a lot on improve multilateralism. So that could be directed to any of you in the panel. How can we move forward in a multilateral way? Thank you.
Wonderful. Lots of room for improvement always. The next speaker over here, please.
My name is Ingolf Schützmüller. I'm a graduate of the Diplomatic Academy, 1971. In 1973, exactly 50 years ago, I started working with the United Nations. My first post was in the southern Sudan. So I have, I'm one of your heroes. Ambassador Marschik said yesterday, those who worked for the United Nations. I have observed the United Nations and its development over the last 50 years, the first 30 years when I was officially working with them, then 10 years in the consultative role, and then the last 10 years as a pensioner. And when I heard and when I saw our conference here, reinvigorating the United Nations, I got a feeling of déjà vu. Because exactly every 10 years since I started working, there was some movement that the United Nations have to be reinvigorated, was not the word, but revamped or reorganized or whatever. It was always based on some critics of some major donor countries, especially one donor country, which I don't mention now, which was mostly in the forefront for these critics. And so every 10 years there was a big effort made in various ways to change and to improve the United Nations. During my work with the United Nations, I was inter alia the resident coordinator in Kabul during the Russian occupation, and I finished my work as the director for environment program with UNDP in New York. But what I wanted to tell you is the following. From 1985, the Vienna University asked me to arrange for a study tour for political science students of the Vienna University to New York, which I organized for 30 years. And in 1985, I went to the Department of Public Information, and they helped me very much in organizing this study tour, or 2-week study tour. And next year again. And then in 1987, I said to the university, no, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm embarrassed to again ask the Department of Public Information, and they do a lot of work, and said, please, once more. So I went there again, and very timidly I said, could you please help once again? And they said, why are you asking this so timidly? Don't you know that this is the best thing ever happened to us? That we can speak to future decision makers? Don't you know that public relations is the weakest point of the United Nations? And in all these years, ever since, I don't see that this has in any way changed. I think this is the big problem of the United Nations, that they do not have a professional approach to public relations worldwide. Has any one of you ever heard of a United Nations conference that it worked out well? Only criticism. The journalists are not educated enough. They don't know that when a conference is laid out that they always put as goals twice as much as they know that they can achieve. But in the world public, it is seen as a defeat. And that is unfortunately always the case. And one last point. I read once a statistic that about 80% of whenever the United Nations are mentioned in the public, in newspapers or the radio, it is because of the Security Council. Security Council gives the UN, unfortunately, a bad name because it doesn't function well. And nobody knows that actually the United Nations have nothing to do with the Security Council except that they loan them a hall and a few offices, and then these 15 countries are doing what they are not supposed to do. But the blame goes to the United Nations. Well, I don't know if something can be done in this respect. Maybe one could kick them out and handle them like the International Criminal Court, separate from the United Nations, and our image would go up. I was very much impressed with the panel, especially the philosophical aspect of Mr. Platzer. I agreed with everything except for one word which you said. The UN was a great organization. Not was, it still is. It might not be perfect, but I think it's the best what the global community did in this last century. Thank you.
And you see, this is why the UN does not need a PR, lots of PR efforts, because they have you. Who else wants to put a question? I see over here, please. Two, please. Front row. That lady was first. Okay, please.
Hello. I just want to say thank you very much for all the insightful talks, and my brain's going crazy with all the ideas. And I'm a student at the Diplomatic Academy, and I wanted to ask Angela May a question. You mentioned that currently there is an unequal or uneven global data collection, and I was just wondering, what are the ways that we can improve what's it called, joint responsibility, and yeah, just strive to achieve this? Thank you.
Okay, and one question here.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, two more. And then I will close because I then want to give the panelists a moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the panelists, for the great presentations. I have two questions, one for Angela and one for everyone. Maybe I start with everyone. I just wanted to, because we're talking about reinvigorating the United Nations, and in my discussions with other members of this conference, I think we have the understanding that when we talk about the United Nations, we talk about member states. And when we talk about member states, we talk about governments. And when we talk about governments, we actually talk about also the responsibility of the governments towards the people. And then we go back again to the Charter of the United Nations, the very first wording, with the people. So just a question, a comment, but also a question to all the panelists. What should be the role, or what should be the role of we the people in reinvigorating the United Nations? I think the Security Council, we understand that it's broken, it's not working. We all agree on that. But the people sitting in the Security Council are the representatives of our governments. So what is our role as we the people in reinvigorating the United Nations, meaning how can we hold them accountable? And Angela, a question for you. I really like your global architecture for data. And I was wondering, do you see also the role of academia, the young researchers, maybe NGOs working on the ground, dealing with everyday issues of the people? Do you see them in contributing to this architecture, new architecture of global data? Thank you so much.
We have one more question over here, I think. Professor Marbo, over there. please put up your hand so that we know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for this really very interesting, lively panel in late afternoon, so we still are awake, all of us. Thank you very much. In particular, my question or remark goes to Klaus Bachmann on international justice, because he depicted the various possibilities of bringing justice in the Ukraine, in the case of Russia against Ukraine. I agree. I would say personally, totally with your conclusions that leave it to universal jurisdiction by national courts on the one hand. Here we have the problem, however, of immunity, which will then be overcome after our time of office. And on the other side, not undermining what the ICC already is doing, having investigations and so on, and not, let it work. But I don't see that there would be a problem of immunity, because that's the whole purpose of the ICC, to establish an international criminal court regardless of immunity. And even for then getting those, so having an arrest warrant, for those parties to the ICC, there would not be a problem of priority. So they would have to extradite. And this is even proven by South African case of al-Bashir, because it was finally decided by the competent court in South Africa that they should extradite al-Bashir. It was only a few hours too late. He had already left the country. So I think that's the prevailing view, that there is no problem of immunity when you have an ICC arrest warrant.
Thank you. And I can also just, if we have the last and final question from Professor Kornprobst here, I think they also wouldn't see two tribunals being established at the same time, because simply for the fact that the states that request these tribunals are the same in a regional organization and at the UN, and if one of them works, they would immediately halt the progress about that on the other organization. So please, Professor Kornprobst, final question to the
thanks
panel.
a lot. I would have a question for Natalie. And Natalie, I really enjoyed your talk and you looking at public opinion and public perceptions and everything. And just out of curiosity, I'd like to know, so you talked about the perception of the United Nations as a tool of the West, as a tool of great powers. And what has changed about these perceptions over time? Do you have data on that? So perhaps on the impartiality one. We had a presentation yesterday on UN peacekeeping, and there was some evidence there's perception of more partiality there now. So I was wondering whether you have data on that more generally. And probably one of the very, very interesting aspects there would be the latest ones, even the 2022, so whether the Russian aggression against the Ukraine and the UN reaction or lack thereof had any impact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us back to the panel, and I would go again in the same order that we have established before. I would ask you, for the sake of time, to take 3 minutes each in your answers. Thank you. Please, Angela, you go first.
Thank you. And thank you for the great questions. One, is a change in trust after the COVID. I would say yes. There is maybe among some member states, maybe not all, as we would thought, but there has been a vibrant civil society, think tanks, academics, community that are really now building also a lot of a momentum for the COVID. For example, there have been about, I think, 150 entities that they have written to the head of WHO, asking for a resolution of a General Assembly, a Health Assembly, on data, on that exactly common space. I believe probably without COVID, that push would not have happened. So, yes, crisis sometimes trigger also good things. Then that's also another great question. How do we build that joint commitment? That's the most difficult and challenging. But the way how we look at it is, building the incentives. So what are the incentives of sharing good data together? And for example, again, we saw it with COVID. If you build a system by which, we have free flows of people, among those that have the data, so that we know, the level of the public health that you have in the country I have, so I feel comfortable to do things that maybe I would not feel comfortable in doing with others that don't share data. Again, don't have the time over 3 minutes. There is an example on the IMF when they really establish for membership, and I have to say, I cannot say what member, they threat a member if you don't share the data according to our quality standards, you have threatened your membership to the IMF. So is that's incentive to be part of a club, then you gain something, but you have to give something. So, but that is great. And then believe the role of the academic, of the people for the data, and and that, if may I turn back a question to you on because when at least we talk among ourselves, among statisticians, among those that really this communication on this data architecture, we say, can we think about a convention that does not include only member states? Because today, data do not, now in a way the train has already left the station, and data is not a monopoly of states anymore. And that's where it plays the community, the academia, the private sector, etc. Is it possible to think about a system of convention that is not only among member states? There are few examples, but not. So I want to turn it back to you. So thank you. And I appreciate, may I say a comment, that indeed we live today in a better world. I mean, there is a lot of pessimism. But again, if you look at the data, you see that we've made a lot of progress.
Wonderful. That's we should have ended with this positive note, but we don't. We continue. We go straight on to Natalie, please.
Thank you. And I'll start with the question, the last question about the data. So I think it's really interesting, and I'm hoping to build out a more scientific analysis of this where everyone can kind of deep dive and access the data over time. But it's interesting to see that even though there can be an event that's very polarizing, the trends tend to reset. So the countries that are directly affected by the event, opinions will change about polarization of the UN, its effectiveness, etc. But in general, they go back to normal pretty quickly. The latest data we have was from the summer of last year, which focused very much on the UN's response or not to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in general, the very broad brush picture was in the West, particularly G7 countries, so Japan included, were much less satisfied with the UN's performance. Clearly, they see the Security Council and the core security portfolio of the UN as the most important. However, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, you're still seeing over 60, 70, 80% for how the UN has handled the situation. I think the focus on the global fallout from Ukraine, the focus that the Secretary General put, the grain deal, all of those things I think have helped. In the Middle East and North Africa, quite frankly, over 15 years, it's always quite low and has remained the same. And there, a lot of the repeated comments were about double standards in relation to Palestine, ignoring crisis in Yemen, Syria, etc. So it remains always a low point. I just wanted to make a couple of other points on the other questions. I think this point about the need for vision and bravery, I do think that is one of the soft power roles that the Secretary General could play and actually has played quite a lot of the past couple of years. I think he has been very good in saying, things were not perfect by any means. In 1945, the UN does have a grounding of patriarchy and colonialism in its structures. There is a need for the West to accept that it has benefited over many years from systems that have not benefited others. I think we need to look at burden sharing in a different way. It's not just who provides the aid, it's who's actually taking in the refugees, who's actually on the front line of climate change, etc. So I do think there is space for that. And the self-interest reason there is, if we don't make the systems and institutions fairer, then there will be fragmentation. And you see that already with the BRICS Development Bank. They don't put the conditions and pressures on countries that we get from the traditional institutions. So we could be looking at a fragmented international system without that. And then just quickly on cycles of reform, I mean, I've been part of cycles of reform and consultations. I think they do happen cyclically, but I do think this feels a bit different. Usually what happens is there's some kind of issue or pressure. Everyone discusses, lots of ideas are put on the table. They're watered down, negotiated. Some of them are adopted, even fewer are implemented. And you already have a situation where what's actually happened is not in any way matching to the need that was, and certainly not the needs that will be. But this moment is different. I think there is a perfect storm here. First time hunger and poverty on the rise in 3 decades, etc. So I do think there is a need to see this moment and to see reform and reinvigoration as a little bit more urgent than we have in the past.
Thank you very much, Natalie, also staying in the 3 minutes. Fantastic. Next up, Michael, please.
Okay, I'm going to turn myself on.
Yeah.
The solidarity there, that bravery and visions are extremely important. I don't think we can deny it, that Eleanor Roosevelt in the Declaration of Human Rights, the Dag Hammarskjöld, Kofi Annan, they were inspirational. They went an extra mile. I'm not sure that our present Secretary General is the same type of person. And I think we can all do things on a local level, whether it is Martin Luther King or Gandhi or whoever. There are civic actions we could do to make a difference. I will probably disagree with you about that the world is better now. There's a tremendous poverty, and the gaps are growing, and we don't care anymore about poor people. Particularly in Europe, there's racism again. Actual racism. So I will be careful about this now brave new world that we have here, and that is much better than it was in the 50s and 60s. In the 60s, there were a lot of people of vision, and that was probably a good thing. So I leave it there, but we do have to look back and see that there were great visionaries, and we need some of those people again to make the compromises, to go beyond the nation state. And they can be in civil society, and they could be the Pope. I mean, whatever. Yeah, there are good people in the world, and we need them to move forward. And somewhere yesterday there were charts of up and down and up and down, and I think we're at a down point. We're a pretty selfish lot. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Being at a down point means it's going to go up steep, and it's going to go up with Klaus. Please.
Yes, I'm of course biased because of my perspective. I'm of course biased because I have my perspective on the United Nations is a perspective on the ad hoc tribunals, and according to the definition or the requirement from Constantin Gebhardt, I should not talk about that because I'm biased. I'm doing it anyway. I totally agree with your criticism of the UN's PR activities. I would say I can totally confirm that actually what did a lot of good work for the UN. It's probably not what they should do, but they did it. At the ad hoc tribunals was Human Rights Watch, did a lot to promote the trials, to inform about the trials, to defend the tribunal against criticism and so on. Mostly the prosecutor, not so much the tribunal. That's also a big imbalance. Judges don't like PR. The prosecutor likes it very much because she has to engage in politics. Mirko Clarin is a journalist from the region, from the former Yugoslavia, and in Rwanda or in Arusha, it was basically the Fondation Hirondelle from Switzerland, and they actually did very good job for the tribunals. Okay, I'm stopping on that. The role of the people in the United Nations, I can't say anything about that. I can say something about UN justice or criminal justice. And I'm quite critical about that because it usually doesn't mean that people get access to the court or get access to justice or something like that. They usually get it through intermediaries like NGOs, and they very often have their own agenda. I'm just throwing a slogan here into the room, Akayesu. Very strange things happened there with the access of NGOs to the court. Immunity at the ICC, South Africa, yes, with the ICC there is no such problem. Or at least it's smaller and it's more political. I mean, we can imagine a very small country under huge Russian influence arresting a fugitive, right? And then getting a lot of pressure, and then the question is also how independent is the judiciary there and so on, but not on the legal level. On the legal level, that's clear, and that's one of the arguments I use to leave it to the ICC and to leave it to universal jurisdiction.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Slavomir, please.
Thank you. I was thinking how to answer Billy Butler's question about how to incorporate more civil society into the intergovernmental picture. And I'm for the past few years I was really teaching and writing about some precepts of technical assistance. And before I started doing this, Michael once said to me, you know, Slavomir, what is really sort of falling down in the United Nations is the golden rule. The golden rule. The Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has this golden rule, recite spirit of brotherhood. In two words, in fact, a Chinese invention or addition proposal to the drafting committee. As a digression, in Chinese, it's not she or he, it's not brotherhood or sisterhood, it's a spirit of humankind, spirit of humankind. But coming back to the English word, I really think what is missing for making crime prevention, criminal justice, technical assistance work is the sense of local ownership in the products that the UN or others deliver, a sense of local ownership, that I, as a schoolboy, really understand that I have something from it. Moreover, in my backpack, there is an educational material how, according to the rule of law precepts, I should really conduct myself. Later on, in terms of integrity, of course, when you go to the high school and you go to the university, what I am missing for entire technical assistance is this really win-win, real win-win, not sort of a nominal win-win sense when you have a sense of local ownership in international assistance. That would be my reply to Bill's question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me just maybe also try. I'm not the competent person to answer your question because you put a question to anyone. I think it would be possible to make such a convention if there was political will. If you had the political will and also the will on the sides of the private parties involved, then if that was there, everything seems to be possible. With that, I just want to let me please thank the panelists, virtual and physical.
Thank you.
Thank you also to the audience, and thank you to Professor Kornbrust and the Diplomatic Academy. I will give you the floor in just a second. I just want to say thank you so much because you can hardly do that yourself, so let me do it. Thank you so much. an excellent initiative. I hope that it's continued. And if we take up maybe Michael's suggestion to reinvigorate also to have more youth, maybe the next time at the next conference we should make sure that there's always one student of the Diplomatic Academy on the podium in order to make sure that youth is also represented. I think we've all heard a lot of ideas. We take a big bag of ideas from these 2 days with us, much to think about. Personally, I can tell you I was really happy to hear so much support for the UN. This may be, of course, a biased crowd. It's not probably statistically maybe not representative, but I'm always struck, if you look at some of the data that we get from support for international, regional, and other organizations, the UN usually polls very good, very positive, even though we have, as someone said, as I think we heard from Ingolf, that we had probably not the best PR. And that PR usually results from the Security Council. And I agree, it's so important that also when we talk about the UN, we realize there are so many different parts of the UN. There's this peace work by the Security Council. There's this building over decades and decades of standards, of trying to lift standards globally, which is painstaking work, which we never see if we look at it from 3-4 years. But if we go back 20 years, children's rights, women's rights, if we go back 30 years, climate, if we look at it from a wider perspective, that's also the UN's work. And then, of course, there is the work in the field, where there are thousands of people working every day in the most difficult circumstances trying to help people on the ground. So all of that together has to be borne in mind. When we talk about the UN, we always have to remind everyone the UN is a lot. There's a lot out there that we often forget. Well, I think we try to portray a good picture, a positive picture. I remember 2 years when I went to the UN first, to the UN in New York, and had my first meeting with Melissa, who is the Undersecretary for Information. And I said, there's so much gloom and doom coming out of the UN. Can't we sort of come with a positive picture? She was all for it and said, let's work together on this. And then we had from pandemics and climate and everything, the world didn't want to play along, unfortunately. We just didn't get the picture that would fit a happy scenario. But I am completely with those who say that we live in a wonderful world. And I don't know if it was better or worse, etc. I think the fact that we can sit here together, talk about the UN for 2 days, and we're not out there foraging for food and killing each other in the process, that's amazing. I mean, let's think about it. It's warm in here, there's light. We seem as humans to be able to come up with the most amazing organizational skills that allow us to live a world in peace. And I think internationally, the UN is a big part of that. And I think that's worth fighting for. So thank you so much. And Professor Kornbrobst, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Also a fantastic panel. I really, really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot to all of you. Angela taught us a lot about data today. I also collected data now. So we were 13 hours in this conference. There were 26 speakers. There were 25 presentations. There were 2 dialogues, 4 panels. There were about 60 questions and comments. Yeah? And I think if we put all of this together, then there were really quite a lot of ideas for reinvigorating the United Nations. Some more concrete, some perhaps a little more philosophical, but I think both of them are really, really needed. To some extent, this is obviously now the end of the conference. There is no debating about this. But it obviously should not be the end of us trying to reinvigorate the United Nations. And there are probably various ways of doing that. So for me, as a scholar, probably the primary instinct is to move now towards a publication, and we're going to make an edited book or a special issue with a journal out of the conference proceedings. But that's obviously only the academic side, and there obviously should be another side as well. And I think it's well worth pursuing some of those ideas and moving them actually also towards the United Nations, be it in Vienna or be it also elsewhere, and I think especially in New York. And anyone having ideas for that, please, more than welcome, so that the ideas will not stay in this room, but they're actually gonna get out and perhaps even gonna cross the Atlantic. Good, so then thanks a lot to everyone. Thanks a lot to the presenters, to the chairs, to our technical people. You did a fantastic job. And and most of all, actually, thank you to the audience, in person and also online, because a conference without an audience, well, it wouldn't be a conference. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.